Hi all, this is Dr. S.J. Kala, an Associate Professor of English. Hi all, this is Dr. S.J. Kala, an Associate Professor of English at Fatima College, Madurai. So now, in this video, we're going to look at Terry Eagleton's Capitalism, Modernism and Postmodernism. I have structured my presentation in 5 different sections, and this particular video is going to have the first 2 sections of the essay. So I begin with an introduction, and in the introduction I would like to tell you that in Terry Eagleton's Capitalism, Modernism and Postmodernism, he critiques the relationship between capitalism and culture, and he focuses on how modernism and postmodernism respond to the economic systems that shape them. So Eagleton explores these movements through historical materialism, and he examines how capitalism's commodification of culture affects at the artistic and ideological levels, affects the artistic and ideological productions. So we see that in capitalism and cultural production. So that's the first part of this essay. It can be further divided into commodification of culture, culture as ideological struggle, and the different responses, especially in the form of modernism and postmodernism, to this relationship between capitalism and cultural production are to be dealt in detail. So you find that in this particular section, Eagleton delves deeper into the base superstructure relationship, and this base superstructure relationship is a key concept in Marxist theory, and he uses this to analyze the production of culture under capitalism. So we see that according to historical materialism, the economic base consisting of the material conditions of production, such as a capitalist mode of production, shapes and determines the superstructure. So when I say superstructure, it includes culture, politics and ideology. So it's the economic base that talks about all the materials that are involved in the production. So it talks about the capitalist mode of production, it also talks about the shapes, and it determines the superstructure. So Eagleton proceeds further to argue that art and culture, they do not exist in isolation from the economy, rather they are deeply intertwined with the capitalist system, and it is the capitalist system that molds their form, content and function. So bearing this in mind, let's further look into the commodification of culture. So Eagleton emphasizes that under capitalism, culture becomes a commodity. That is to say, it is subject to the demands of the market. So everything is based on what sort of demands arise in the market. So this commodification of culture he refers to as a transformation of art, literature and the other cultural products into items. So they are not just something to be admired, something to be appreciated, but they have been transformed into items that can be bought and sold. So in a capitalist economy, even cultural expressions are shaped by the forces of production, and after production doesn't stop there, how you distribute it among the consumers and in what way and in what pattern it's consumed. So it all depends on the production, distribution and consumption. And it's believed that art is no longer produced solely for its intrinsic value, but it's commodified, where the meaning, it is commodified. When we say it's commodified, you find that it is valued for its exchange value, rather than its use value. So what is given importance or what is given priority is exchange value is given priority over use value or deeper symbolic meaning. Okay, so you find that the market logic of capitalism reduces the whole structure of culture to a system of just signs and representations, and these can be easily packaged, consumed, and discarded. So you should understand that this is an era of instant gratification, an era of disposable products. So we belong to an era of use and throw culture. So it can be, that's what they say by saying it can be easily packaged, consumed, and discarded. And resultantly, the artistic autonomy is lost. And this autonomy was earlier there in the cultural forms, and everybody seemed to have been enjoying it, but then it has started increasingly being undermined, and therefore you find that the culture has now become part of a broader system of commodity exchange. So Eagleton illustrates this by showing how both modernism and postmodernism are shaped by their reactions to or the way they or the complicity with this commodification. So though they express different responses to the pressures of the capitalist market. What does Eagleton mean by different responses? Modernism responds to the capitalist market in a different way, and postmodernism responds in a different way. So both do not do it in the similar pattern. So having dealt with that, we now move on to look at culture as ideological struggle. So in what way do we find culture as an ideological struggle? Let's first take the commodification of culture. It's not just an economic process, but it's an ideological struggle. So when we see that culture is commodified, we also have to observe and underline the fact that it has become now a battleground for ideas, values, and power. So the superstructure is a superstructure, and in this superstructure you have ideologies, new ideologies, and these ideologies reproduce the dominant values and interests, again, of the capitalist base. So this process ensures that cultural products, while appearing to be autonomous and neutral, often reflect and reinforce the interest of the ruling capitalist class. So Eagleton is inspired by Marxist theories of ideology, and he uses that to argue that the culture industry, much like the production of goods, is involved in maintaining the status quo. So by commodifying culture, capitalism is stripping itself of its aura and the radical potential. So it transforms it into an ideological tool. You find that the cultural products that are mass produced under capitalism obscure the true relations of power and production. There's always a link between power and what is being produced. So this relationship between the power and production is being obscured because of this mass production, and thereby it brings forth the inherent contradictions of the capitalist society. Eventually, cultural products frequently function to perpetuate the illusion of freedom and choice within a system that is fundamentally exploitative and unequal. So the distribution is not equal, it is unequal, and you find that it's quite exploitative. Okay, so having dealt with that, let's now move further to look at the different responses from modernism and postmodernism. So Eagleton discusses how postmodernism and modernism are both cultural movements. So if I have to repeat this way, how modernism and postmodernism are cultural movements. And these two cultural movements are shaped by and responding to the commodification of culture. So modernism is something that emerged in the early 20th century, and please note, only modernism resisted the mass production of art, and it started trying to protect art's aesthetic autonomy. So modernism resisted the mass production of art, and it tried to guard art's aesthetic autonomy. And modernist works often appeared to stand apart from capitalist logic. So when you look deeper into them, you find that they are never influenced by the capitalist logic. So modernist works started promoting innovation, self-reflexivity, and a rejection of mass culture's vulgarity. Okay. So however, Eagleton notes that despite its efforts to retain its independence, modernism was also commodified. Its avant-garde techniques and forms became integrated into the capitalist markets as time passed by. So, having looked at modernism, now we move on to postmodernist response to the capitalism and cultural production. So, within the context of late capitalism, we find that it is quite different from modernism. And so, to talk about this, Eagleton draws from Ernest Mandel's concept, which embraces the commodification of culture. So we find that in postmodernist art and literature, the line that divides the art and literature, or the boundaries, you find that it is blurred. So the boundaries between high and low culture, or rather elite culture and low culture, are freely mixed up with all sorts of genres, styles, and media, and they often seem to be celebrating this collapse of distinctions, this blurring of the lines or boundaries between high and low culture, and the mixing up of the genres. So we find that in postmodern culture, there is this pastiche, irony, and surface level aesthetics that dominate, reflecting the fragmented, decentered nature of late capitalist societies. In the essay, Eagleton begins to draw a contrast between pastiche and parody. So he says that pastiche is just a kind of an imitation. It's just a mimic, okay? And it doesn't have the satirical note or the humorous note that parody always carries with it. And talking about it, Eagleton also talks about postmodernism's accommodation of capitalist logic and how it signifies a retreat from the ideological struggle that modernism still clung on to, or that it was still engaged with. Okay, I know it was not perfectly done, but even if it was imperfectly done, modernism was still engaged with it. So let me just sum up all that we've seen so far. Eagleton's analysis of capitalism's influence on culture reveals that artistic movements cannot be understood in isolation from their economic context. And so both modernism and postmodernism are cultural responses to the conditions created by capitalism, particularly the commodification of culture. And so when we saw modernists seeking to resist this commodification, postmodernists were happy embracing it, and they reflected the changing nature of capitalism from its early industrial phase to its late capitalist stage. So understanding the relationship between capitalism and cultural production is very, very necessary to get to know about the ideological stakes that are at play in these artistic movement. So having dealt with that, now we move on to the reaction of modernism to capitalism. So that can be further divided into rejection of realism and bourgeois ideology, modernist aesthetics, which involves self-reflexivity and fragmentation, then aesthetic autonomy and avant-garde movements, high art versus mass culture, then the last one being avant-garde and commodification. So now let's look into modernism's reaction to capitalism, and let me give you an overview of it. So here Eagleton tries to present modernism as a complex response to two things: alienation and fragmentation that were caused by the onset of early industrial capitalism. Here he argues that modernist literature and art were basically reactions to the broader economic and social changes that were tugged along with the changes from pre-capitalist forms of life to the capitalist modes of production. So this shift disrupted the traditional social relations, and it led to a sense of alienation that you find in most of the modernist works. So you find, having dealt with that, now we move on to look at the rejection of realism and bourgeois ideology. So Eagleton highlights that one of modernism's most significant response to capitalism was its rejection of realism. It did not approve of realism. So realism was something that had been quite prevalent in the 19th century literature as well as art, and realism was focused on depicting everyday lives, and it tried to deal with the social relationships of individuals, but then the modernists did not want to pay attention to it. They rejected it. So they were like complicit with the bourgeois ideology because it offered a stable, coherent picture of reality that was quite favorable to the capitalist class also, because they had to look into that also, right? So it suited the interests of the capitalist class, so they were comfortable with the way they picturized reality, who the modernists picturized reality. Therefore, they started also reinforcing the idea of a fixed, knowable world in which the status quo could be maintained. So they did not deal with the world that they did not know about. And now here we find that modernism aimed to disrupt this complacent representation of reality. How? By foregrounding the fragmentation and alienation. I told you earlier itself that modernism's main focus was on fragmentation and alienation. And why did they proceed to foreground this? Because this was something that was experienced by almost all sorts of individuals in a rapidly industrializing urban world. So Eagleton argues that modern writers and artists, they started trying to reflect the deeper truths about human existence, especially under capitalism. So they started focusing on a system that alienated individuals from each other, okay, from their work and from the world around them. So they started probing into human existence against the backdrop of capitalism, which dealt rather with a system that alienated individuals from three things. What are they? From each other, from their work, and from the world around them. So modernist works or modernist writers, they therefore started rejecting linear narratives. See, this linear narrative was something that we all have been familiar with, that was quite traditional and so on. So they started rejecting linear narratives. They also were not very particular about causal relationships, cause-effect relationships, and mimetic representations of reality, because they always promoted, or they always were after two things. What were they? Formal innovation and experimentation. So now that we have looked at that, let's move on to the next part of it, that's modern aesthetics, self-reflexivity and fragmentation. So this is quite different. Eagleton points to the self-reflexivity and fragmentation, and he says that you find that in most of the modernist literature and art.
self-reflexivity, or the tendency for works where the work start looking at itself, or it starts looking at the creative process. So the work was more focused on itself. It started reflecting itself by drawing attention to their own form, first point. Second, by drawing attention to the processes of creation. And the third, by mirroring the disintegration of traditional forms of social cohesion under capitalism. So in modernist works, the human mind is often portrayed as fragmented, and thus it reflected the disorienting effects of industrialization and urbanization. So to talk about this, Eagleton brings examples from the works of James Joyce and Virginia Woolf. So in Joyce's Ulysses, the use of stream of consciousness technique allows readers to experience the protagonist's fragmented and disjointed thoughts, and it also reverberates or echoes the chaotic inner life of the individuals who were alienated by the impersonal forces of industrial capitalism. So similarly, in Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, you find the narrative. I told you that they rejected linear narrative. So you find that the narrative shifts between different perspectives and internal thoughts, and thus it rejects the idea of a coherent, unified self, and it starts reflecting the fragmented nature of modern existence. So in T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, Eagleton sees a powerful example of modernism's aesthetic of fragmentation, and in this you find that the poem's disjointed structure represents the collage of voices, or the different voices that are put together. It talks about the languages and references and its depiction of a decaying and spiritually desolate world, which captures the sense of cultural breakdown that you find very specifically in the 20th century capitalism. So the fragmentation in Eliot's work is not just a stylistic choice, but it's a representation of the broader breakdown of social and cultural cohesion in an increasingly alienating world. So having discussed that, we now move on to analyze the aesthetic autonomy and avant-garde movements and Eagleton's views on them. So Eagleton explores modernism's attempts to preserve aesthetic autonomy. The idea, so when I say aesthetic autonomy, what do I mean by that? The idea that art should remain independent of external pressures. There should not be any external pressures such as that of the commodification or capitalism and so on. So particularly it shouldn't have the pressures from the demands of the market. So early modernists believed that art was one arena that could resist the commodification which was imposed on culture by capitalism. So how could they do that? By creating works that were difficult, complex, and by being resistant to easy consumption. So they also felt that by developing avant-garde techniques, there could be some kind of aesthetic autonomy. So what sort of avant-garde techniques? Avant-garde techniques like abstract art, dissonant music, and experimental literature. And so modernists tried to aim at maintaining a realm of artistic purity which was totally lost. And they also felt that they should separate art from the capitalist system's drive so that it is not commodified and it survives in its purest form. So now Eagleton critiques the technique as ultimately unsuccessful. The techniques adopted by modernists as ultimately unsuccessful. The most radical avant-garde movements such as Dadaism and Surrealism, they challenge and disrupt bourgeois values which were absorbed by the capitalist system, they sought to resist. See, the capitalist system must have been resisted, but it couldn't do that. For instance, Andre Breton's surrealism is an anti-capitalist movement that aimed to unlock the unconscious and liberate human creativity from the constraints of bourgeois rationality. So we find that bourgeois rationality was gradually commodified and transformed. They tried to restrain from all these things and constrain, but then it was gradually commodified and transformed into a mainstream artistic style. So similarly, Tristan Tzara's Dadaism, with its emphasis on chaos, absurdity, and anti-art, was co-opted by the culture industry, and so we find that it lost its radical edge. So we need to be really very radical in opposing certain things, but then everything was made subtle and it lost its radical edge. So the work of Theodor Adorno and the Frankfurt School explain how the capitalist culture industry was able to even commodify modernism. So Adorno goes on to explain that the culture industry turned the most avant-garde and resistant forms of art into commodities for mass consumption. So as modernist art became fashionable, it was marketed to not low-class people but a growing middle-class audience, and turning its radical innovation into products that could be consumed like any other commodity. So there was not much of a difference. So like any other commodity, it was just made so subtle and so insignificant. Thus modernism's high art sensibilities and formal experimentation was a kind of a challenge to the bourgeois values, which were integrated into the commodity form, and thus it blurred the line between avant-garde culture and mass-produced entertainment. So here, having looked into this, now we move on to look at the distinction between high art versus mass culture. We find that modernism's reaction to capitalism is the opposition between high art and mass culture. And modernist artists position themselves in opposition to mass culture, and modernists felt that the mass culture was degraded, commercialized, and that it was more inclined towards the tastes of the bourgeois. And therefore, they started distancing themselves from popular forms of culture, and by doing so, they created a refined, elitist culture that resisted the commodification of capitalist society. So Eagleton notes the separation of high and low culture was not something that evolved naturally, but it was something that evolved due to the capitalist social relations. So it was a product of the capitalist social relations. So in capitalist societies, cultural forms are divided into elite and popular categories. This division between the elite and popular categories itself talks about the broader class distinction that you find within capitalism, and you find that the ruling class always produced and consumed elite and autonomous art, while on the contrary, the working class consumed mass-produced and commodified culture. So Eagleton argues that modernism's insistence on aesthetic autonomy and its disdain for mass culture were not able to sustain. So they were unsustainable. So as modernism became more established, its innovations were appropriated by the capitalist system, and the distinction between high art and mass culture became increasingly blurred. So now, having looked at that, we move on to further probe into avant-garde and commodification. So we find that despite its attempts to resist commodification, modernism's avant-garde experiments could not escape the logic of the market. So the techniques that the modernists used to challenge capitalism, the techniques like formal innovation, fragmentation and self-reflexivity, they themselves were commodified. Okay, so modernist art's emphasis on complexity and difficulty was there. So in modernist art you find complexity and difficulty and a kind of a depth also. This was intended, or this was promoted mainly to create a critical distance from mass culture. But gradually it became a form of capital in itself, as it was marketed to an elite audience as a sign of cultural sophistication. So they were very happy with it. Okay, so the commodification of modernist art demonstrates the limitations of aesthetic autonomy under capitalism. So Eagleton notes the capitalist system is highly adaptable. It's able to absorb and commodify even the most resistant forms of art. So this process reveals the deep entanglement of culture. So culture cannot be separated, it's almost intertwined with the economic base, where even the most radical cultural movements are ultimately shaped by the demands of the capitalist market. So having looked at all of these so far, let me just sum them up for you. So Eagleton's analysis of modernism shows how the movement was shaped by the alienating effects of capitalism and how it attempted to resist the commodification of culture through formal innovation and avant-garde techniques. However, modernism's insistence on aesthetic autonomy ultimately failed to escape commodification, which was one of the forces of the capitalist system. So you find that Eagleton argues that the fate of modernism demonstrates the inescapable nature of commodification in capitalist societies, where even the most radical artistic movements are absorbed into the market, and you find them transformed into products just for consumption, and then they lose their aura. So with that we come to an end. So thank you so much for your patient watching. I'm sure this was of some help to you.